Good morning, everyone. My name's Kimber, and I'm here to talk to you about vulnerability disclosure policies, hacking responsibly. We'll touch briefly on bug bounties. I'll explain why. And then we can just open it up for Q&A, any questions that folks have. I want to make sure I leave some. I'd prefer this be a discussion type thing. I just respond better to that, and I think that you all will too. So feel free to raise a hand if you want to ask a question. Don't feel like you're interrupting. Okay, so here we go. Hi to everyone online. My name is Kimber. I'm the head of infrastructure engineering and chief incident responder at 18F. 18F is a digital delivery services, we'll say, organization housed within the General Services Administration of the U.S. government. 18F has done a lot of pioneering work with agile development, digital delivery. Their infrastructure is all cloud-based, which is pretty unique in the federal space. And so that's a little bit about 18F. And then I also serve as a mission information specialist at NASA. I've been with NASA about 5.5 years. And the work I do there is very different. NASA is on iron or brick and mortar data centers, not cloud-based. Some VMware. I secure clusters for lasers, cryogenics, and optic systems. It just sounds cool to say, so I'll just tell you. Advocate of encryption, transparency, privacy, open source solutions. A lot of that comes from the federal space. I think that the U.S. government has lost the trust of the people over time, and I think the way that we can rebuild that is through transparency. So if we're gathering data in the government space, let's show folks on GitHub like what data we're gathering, what we're doing with it, where it's going, how we're filtering it. Maybe we can start to rebuild some trust. And then I'm on Twitter, miss that, not safe for it. Okay, so a vulnerability disclosure policy. Who knows what it is? Who's ever looked at one? Yeah? You want to tell me?
Sure. So it's effectively a policy that allows outside users to kind of report vulnerabilities to companies.
Perfect.
Without getting involved.
Yeah, so for folks on the line, he said it's a policy that lets folks know where they can disclose vulnerabilities, which is exactly right. A VDP will just, I'm going to say VDP. I try not to use too many acronyms, but we can agree I can use that one. Right? So the VDP is going to stipulate guidelines for what that reporting should look like and establish a few rules of engagement. So let's talk a little bit more about VDPs. I like memes, so these slides aren't going to mean a lot to people who just get them emailed to them after the talk, but here we go. So when we say security researchers, we also hackers. You've heard like white hat hackers, gray hats, black hats, good actors, bad actors. It's all in the same realm of what we're talking about. People who are accessing computer systems with or without permission. We hope with permission. When folks refer to themselves as security researchers, though, presumably they're wearing white hats. So companies have vulnerabilities. Every company does. Probably your network's crawling with them, and you don't know you have them. Or maybe you do. Maybe security does, and they're just really hoping you don't find them before they have a chance to fix them. But what happens if you do find them? So that's kind of what we're talking about today. Does IU have a VDP? Does anybody know? Like if you go to iu.edu and you find like just a raging SQL injection vulnerability or a place where you can do cross-site scripting on the main page, does anybody know like who you'd tell? Yeah, I have no idea. I probably should have researched that before I came because that's like an excellent example. But that's what security researchers deal with every day. I found a thing while I was on this site. Right. So when I say companies don't have a VDP, they assume they'd know if they had a problem. So it's very arrogant, right, to assume that I, as a university, would just assume if a student found a problem on the site that they would just come tell me. Well, what if they can't find you? what if they're scared to tell you? What if they're scared they stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to like click on and they're going to get in trouble for telling you? So I'll talk a little bit about like devs are developing, hackers are hacking. How many folks have taken like computer programming classes in here? Some. Have you talked about a thing baked in security? Is this a concept you've heard before? So right from the beginning of the software development life cycle, you think about security issues that you could have. So as you're developing, you're addressing security issues all along instead of after the fact coming back and trying to fix them. Because we all know once it hits like 80, 85% done, like you're probably going to push it to production and cross your fingers and hope for the best. And you'll come back and fix those other things later, but you won't. You really won't. All right. So in that vein, companies will think maybe you could contact them in email or Twitter, or social media if you find something. But if you don't have a clear path for disclosure, it's anyone's guess what's going to happen. The reason that I think this is important to discuss with you all is as you go out into the world as security professionals, that this is a thing that you take with you. I'm working right now closely with DHS to write a directive for federal agencies to implement vulnerability disclosure policies sort of across the federal space. So it's not that this is a nice to have. Pretty soon this is going to be a must have in the federal space, and the private sector tends to follow pretty closely with things like NIST policy, and there's some guidance also right now in NIST with this. So we really need to think about clear paths for disclosure. So my hope is you'll take this and go out to the masses and say, hey, IU, do we have a vulnerability disclosure policy? How do people report bugs?
So some of the people who are online with us are the US UISO, who are a security office.
Yeah.
And they would be who we would respond to with an issue. Mike here in just a few minutes might chat me in the Zoom chat and let me know if there's a live link online that we can direct people to.
That would be great.
Right. Can you hear me?
So POC
okay.
Is proof of concept in this space. So if we want to talk about
can you hear me?
How you found the bug. So you found the bug, how did you find it? And you want to report it. It's very, very helpful for the folks you're reporting to if you tell them how you did what you did, right? So we call that a proof of concept. It's really great to just include that in your vulnerability disclosure policy to say, hey, when you're reporting to us, could you please tell us how you did it? What's like the holy grail for us too in the federal space is if the researcher says, hey, I found this, here's how, and here's what you need to do to fix it. Because then we can just validate the bug, triage the fix, and then maybe push the fix out a little faster instead of just a misconfiguration in Cloudflare and we don't know how to fix it. So as a researcher, if you find a vulnerability and you submit a proof of concept, it lends credibility to the idea that you're a white hat hacker. So if for some reason you did face a legal challenge, you could say, hey, like clearly I wasn't trying to be malicious because I showed them how I did it and told them how to fix it. So that's sort of a cover your butt kind of thing. So when? So let's say you find a vulnerability. Like you want to tell the world about it. You want to go do a talk about it at Black Hat or DEF CON. When do you get to do that? Well, if there's not a vulnerability disclosure policy in place that's telling you, it's kind of like, who knows? This researcher could disclose tomorrow and we don't have resources to fix the bug, or maybe they'll give us time. Maybe we can work with them. We don't know. You're in this very gray area because researchers don't really have a responsibility to do the right thing. We would hope they would give you a chance to fix it. But if we outline in a vulnerability disclosure policy how long we as a company agree to take to fix the bug before you can announce it, like we've shown a good faith effort that we plan to fix it. So this is kind of a mixed bag, and I'll just talk about it for a second. But say you find a giant vulnerability on a website that's leaking PII, right? It's exposing user social security numbers, names, birthdays, family members. And the company is like, well, you can't disclose till we fix it. But you have like no VDP in place. You have no assurances as a researcher that it'll get fixed. At what point do you hit this like moral / ethical dilemma that you reported this vulnerability 6 months ago, the site's still leaking data? Like, when do you get to tell the public? Because the public has a right to know if their data is being compromised or exposed, right? So this is where we'll get into issues of CFAA versus maybe it's reaching out to US CERT, finding someone that you could tell, like, hey, this is an issue. And in many cases, it's probably going to have to be the government that steps in and takes over on the vulnerability, particularly if there's no good faith effort to fix it, right? We've all heard of Equifax, right? Like I don't know, what was the latest numbers on that? Like 1 billion records or something? Like, it's kind of ridiculous. But it happens in the Fed space too, because we heard of the OPM breach, right? Every federal person I know right now had all of our data exposed through the OPM breach. So it happens to everyone. All right, so let's talk about jail. Because why wouldn't we? So let's say you find something, why wouldn't you report it? Let's say you go out into the world and you're security professionals in your field and Joe Hacker found a bug, like, why didn't he tell you? Well, CFAA. So who knows what CFAA stands for? Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So this is a very vaguely, and people can be mad at me, but I'm going to say poorly written law that prohibits accessing a computer without prior authorization or in excess of the authorization that they've been given. CFAA, if you Google like CFAA vague or CFAA like messed up, any string of bad words, you'll find plenty of researchers explaining to you why CFAA offers little to no protection to security researchers operating in the white hat space. Technically, as CFAA is written now, any sort of research could be considered unauthorized access. The catch being, unless the company, organization, agency has a vulnerability disclosure policy in place. If you have a vulnerability disclosure policy in place, that's where you can tell researchers, hey, it is actually okay to look at our stuff. And as long as you operate in good faith, then we won't seek prosecution under CFAA. So the VDP is kind of a loophole to CFAA that lets companies know that, lets researchers know that the companies in question care about them. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah.
So the answer from Mike Sisson, who's the lead security engineer, is that we would put in basically a ticket in our help system and letting them know what the problem is, and they would go through that.
Okay, so it sounds like IU does vulnerability response through the SOC. So the VDP would be what happens before it gets to the SOC. Like, how'd the SOC find out? Did somebody email security@iu.edu? They emailed soc@iu.edu. You probably have like a boilerplate way to report things. Protect, it's called protect.iu.edu to report vulnerabilities. Yeah, so it sounds like they have policies posted. So, you know, you as students, as good stewards of your university, would go and see how easy it was to find that information. Like, if you Google report vulnerability to IU, is it the first hit? Like, do you know, these are things we look for in companies and in the federal space. Right now in the federal space, between 16 and 17, the surveys that we did, it was 5% of agencies had a clear path for reporting vulnerabilities, and only about 10% of private companies. So we're talking about a huge area that's kind of not addressed well in either the public or private sectors. So there has to be a better way, right? So if there's, so here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about why I took up the torch to draft the first vuln disclosure policy for GSA and then publish it on GitHub so that other agencies could at least have a starting point for VDPs at their own agencies. And here's why. Once upon a time in Twitter land, so I'm pretty vocal on Twitter, and it's not a secret that I work for the feds on Twitter. I also have like a pretty long, extensive career as like a hacker, and then later a legitimate pen tester and security researcher. So like my group of folks who keep up with me run the gamut from like really, 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 really dark hats to like super bright shining angel hats. So that said, sometimes I'm the only person that they know who works in the federal space who they know like won't turn them in. That happens. So a few years ago, someone sent me a really horrible vulnerability in the National Broadcasting Service system with just like a Twitter DM saying, hey, I think I just figured out how I could send an Amber Alert for Pikachu to every cell phone in the country. I'm like, cool. Can we like schedule a call? Because I would love to know more about that. But Twitter DMs aren't particularly secure, right? So at least once a week, twice a week, I was having really serious vulnerabilities on federal sites disclosed to me via Twitter. Not ideal. So I started thinking about vuln disclosure policies and what those look like in the federal space. And these are folks who are really trying to tell somebody because they can't find another way to tell anyone, right? If we're talking about 5% or less federal agencies having a path to disclosure, that means most vulnerabilities out there found in the Fed space, like folks aren't going to know how to tell the agency. So I published the VDP for GSA. It took about 6 months to get through our Office of General Counsel because there's a lot of legal stuff in there, like, hey, I'm not going to prosecute you if you are acting in good faith. That kind of language, it actually takes a long time to put together. So then instead of the vulnerabilities for other federal agencies getting reported to me in Twitter DM, then they were reporting them to me through our vuln disclosure platform at TTS, which still, like, I'm not FBI, I'm not DHS, like you're reporting to the wrong place, but at least now we have the reports coming in through an encrypted channel instead of Twitter. So you'll be happy to know that the National Broadcasting System Pikachu Amber Alert issue was fixed, and it had to do with default credentials set on the router at MBS. And I even had trouble tracking down, like even in the federal space, knowing who I know, I think it took me 36 hours to track down an appropriate contact to report the MBS vulnerability. A lot can happen in that span of time. So that's kind of where VDPs came into my world, trying to just bridge the gap between security researchers and the federal space. In 2016, I did a talk at DEF CON. It was Meet the Feds Who Care About Security Researchers. So this is one of the ways to just show that your organization cares about finding and fixing bugs. All right. So does anyone have any questions? Because I'm just going to talk about briefly what a VDP should have. This is so that when you go out into the world, you can fight for your own VDPs, or if you're security researchers, you know what to look for in a VDP before you ever put your hands on a website or an application. Any questions so far? Sure.
So a lot of universities, a lot of companies create other companies application.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I use Microsoft.
Yeah.
So if I find
Sure. So the question for folks online is that if a vulnerability is found in essentially a third-party application that's something that your agency is using, how do you report that? That's a good question. VDPs do tend to address what to do in the event that you find a vulnerability in a third-party application, because those vulnerabilities won't be included in the scope of the organization's policy. So I'll just give you an example. So at 18F, we're using AWS, and we're using, like, our infrastructure sits on a layer of something called Cloud Foundry. So in our VDP, we say if you find vulnerabilities in our applications, great, but if you find one in a third-party application, which in this case would be Cloud Foundry, that is out of scope for our VDP. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't report the vulnerability. You should. And step one would be, if it's Microsoft has a bounty program. Sweet, go get your bounty. So it's always good to check first to see if that third-party application has a clear path for reporting, but you should also report first through the VDP itself to say, hey, I know this is a third-party application out of scope, but I did find this. Because the folks running that organization want to know if you found a bug in the thing they're using. And a lot of times they'll help you coordinate with that third party to disclose responsibly. So it's a good path there. But if there's a bounty, get your bounty. Yeah. Microsoft runs a pretty robust bounty program. Any more questions about that? Yeah.
Do you mean there are cash incentives?
There are cash incentives. We can talk about those in just a little while. I'm less interested in cash incentives as I am in staying out of jail incentives. Yes.
So, coming from the academic background, my incentive would be a paper article. So, are there any discussions about? I know there are bug programs, and there are. Yes, definitely, I don't want to go to jail. But are there any discussions? Because usually, what happens is when you write a paper, it's not accepted in like a month or so. So it will take a longer time for that to be approved. So now we follow a strategy where we report to the companies, and sometimes they reply back with their solutions, or they take in our recommendations, and sometimes they don't take. So when we talk about policies and everything, is there any discussion about what academia should do when they are trying to not just have a presentation out of it, but publish it?
Sure. The question is, how does academia fit into this space past just writing about the research and getting to publication? So that's a good question. And we do time is time is going to be a problem for you, right? Like, because you want to be first. I mean, if we want to be right. So last year, we'll talk about DEF CON last year, Black Hat. We had a vulnerability in one of our applications at GSA. I'm going to be a little bit vague, but you can look up the talk. And we had responsible disclosure, but the researcher was academia and wrote up an amazing disclosure with their proof of concept, how it could be exploited, right? And we found it to be a critical vulnerability. Now, while we had set in the VDP the amount of time we wanted to fix it, the researcher also made it very clear that they wanted to present their findings at Black Hat, right? So instead of our 45 days to fix, all of a sudden we have about 16 days to fix, because they're going to go and disclose at Black Hat. Now, this is the part where researchers and companies have to work together for coordinated disclosure, because we appreciate the finding, we appreciate the POC. The problem on our side was resources, as it always is in the federal space, with getting it fixed in time. We didn't want to tell them they couldn't present at Black Hat. that doesn't foster a good relationship between researchers and the agencies that they're trying to help. So that said, that won't always be the case that you'll get that level of cooperation. In our case, I think the push went to production less than 2 hours before the researcher went on stage to tell 10,000 people about the vulnerability on our site. But we worked with them. So I would say that in this way, the balance that academia is going to have to find is going to be in forging relationships and forging positive relationships with the companies. Now, you said sometimes they don't care and they're not going to fix it. So this is the part where you would probably want to make sure that your research hasn't violated CFAA. And if you can get pretty solid reassurance that you've followed the letter of the law and that you've given this company ample time to fix the bug. There are some standards, there's not really a law, but if you can say, hey, we told them about this 4 months ago and they haven't done anything to respond to it. This is the part where lawyers get involved and you have to send a letter to the company saying, hey, we are planning to disclose this information on this date and we wanted to, as a courtesy, give you time to fix it. What you've seen in the press a lot of times are security researchers disclosing because they've reached that wall that the company won't fix it, but they feel that moral obligation I was talking about earlier. I wish I had like a black and white, clear-cut answer for you, but I think that you have to keep researching, you have to keep writing, you have to keep pushing, and if you can forge these relationships to say, hey, we want to help you, but we also, we have, we want our PhDs and we need to report the thing. Academia is this other place too that you're kind of paralleled with security researchers in general with that whole thing with being first, because you have a concern that the more people you let know about your research, someone's going to steal your research and present it before you can. And we've seen that happen at Black Hat and DEF CON and very publicly people presenting research that we knew someone else did. I wish I had a better answer for you, but keep writing, keep trying to do the right thing. I would focus on places that have policies in place. As a researcher and as my colleagues who are researchers will tell you now, they don't really waste their time looking for vulnerabilities in sites and applications that don't have a clear path for reporting with a promise to fix. I don't know, does that help at all?
That definitely helps a lot. Another quick follow-up on that, when you talked about this particular Black Hat case, so I am assuming they did not report it like 16 or 20 days before regarding the vulnerability. But I'm just thinking that these conferences get their call for papers like months before. That means they have revealed it to at least the reviewers before they reveal it to the company.
Right. Well, maybe. So the CFPs do happen earlier. A lot of the times what you'll see at the security conferences are folks submitting like red team talks, but if you find a critical in a very high profile site, they'll tend to kind of make an exception and squeeze you in if they haven't announced their speakers yet, because they want that visibility of the thing being, call it dropping, right? Dropping the bomb at their conference. But yeah, some of this research is months in advance. In our case, we were notified 4 months before about the vulnerability. We just had no resources to fix it. It involved a major production upgrade and migration, and there was a lot. And we barely pulled it off. But when they disclosed to us, they hadn't had plans to present at Black Hat. So we found out about 2 weeks before Black Hat that they were going to present. And then It's amazing how the resources just showed up to like fix the thing. All right, so we good? Everyone good? We're gonna just talk about a vulnerability disclosure policy. So as a researcher, these are things I want you to look for in the policy. When you go out into the world, these are things I want you to make sure you put in your policies. Sound good? Great. Okay, we're gonna talk basics. Here's the outline, but we're gonna go through one by one. And I know we're probably getting short on time, so. Scope. So when you check the policy, scope is what you're allowed to touch. Is it yourorg.com? So is it iu.edu? Do we have a wildcard.iu.edu? So like spice.iu.edu? What are you allowed to look at? Your policy should be very specific. If you're researching, doing research on a system, hacking a system, follow the scope. That's going to be like your saving grace there. A policy is also going to list vulnerability types. Everything isn't fair game. If iu.edu has a VDP and iu.edu is in scope, that doesn't mean everything is in scope. That doesn't mean that you can just start like doing SQL injections on the site. Like you can't go nuts. Some things are a big deal. Everything isn't a big deal. And this is third-party applications. Like you can't control what the Microsoft plugin's doing on your site. Again, the VDP should be specific about what's covered. You need to have some rules of engagement. So you're going to look for these as you're doing your research and you're finding things. The policy, I recommend that every policy, and this is going into my DHS directive, we're keeping it pretty open and loose as an outline for what VDPs should be, but I'm requesting specifically that we address exfiltration as an absolute no under any circumstances for any federal agency, full stop. There's no world where a researcher needs to exfiltrate data. You could tell me that you think you could, great. You could tell me you're 99% sure you could, great. We're still good. If you pull my data down, we're going after you under CFAA. Like you just can't. So do you remember back when there was a Facebook researcher who said he was like trying to tell Facebook there was this problem, and you know, he tried to let them know they weren't fixing it. So to just like prove to them, he like exfiltrated a bunch of Facebook data, right? So like we know that didn't end up well for him. I think like there's still jail time on the table for that. So look at it all you want, imagine all you want, envision what you can do with it all you want, but if you pull it down, you're going to jail or you're getting fined. Nothing good is going to happen from the exfil, and you don't really need to do it like ever. I just have made it clear no one's going to go home and exfiltrate data from a site vulnerability. Great. Yes.
That's what I was going to say. What's an exfil? Use that term.
Oh yeah. Well, do we understand? So like you think you could get the data. It's just like if the jewelry store is unlocked and you're pretty sure you could go snatch all the diamonds, and you just tell the jewelry store owner, hey, I think you left your door open. Cool. He's going to be really grateful. You might even get a bounty. But if you like go and snatch the diamonds, you're like, see, I told you I could get the diamonds. Like you're just going to jail for B&E, right? Whether the door was open or not. Y'all with me? No one's ever going to exfiltrate data. Great. So potential exploit versus an actual exploit. So these are things you'd put in your policy. Everything isn't going to apply to you. Maybe someone reports to you that they found like a critical vulnerability in Linux, but you know your system's like running in Windows. I don't know. That's like a very vague example, but some things won't apply to you, and that's okay. But you could make it very specific in your VDP. Timelines are super important for both you and for the organization with the VDP. Time to fix, time to disclose, time to panic. So at Black Hat last year, we hit time to panic, right? I wouldn't do research on a site that didn't clearly outline to me how long the company was going to take to fix the thing. Like, I'm happy to report it, and you tell me in good faith, if it's critical, you're going to fix it in 30 days, you know, high, maybe 45, moderate, 60, low, 120. These are kind of loose guidelines. Really, it's up to your org and your resources to decide. those timelines. But once you put them in writing, like you really have to stick to them, because once you hit the wall, like the researcher does get to go out into the world and share their work. So legal, I just like pictures of elephants in rooms. So good faith discoveries. Who thinks they know it? A good faith discovery. What does that mean? It's like a really broad thing to put in a legal document, right? But a lot of VDPs actually have the words like good faith discovery. So say you were following scope and you're doing research for a thing in scope, and it happens that you accidentally pivot to a different system that was not in scope. This has happened to everyone I know. You're like, oh my gosh, what is all this stuff? And then you realize like, oh God, this isn't a server that was in scope. Okay, and you find a thing. That's what we call like a good faith discovery. You weren't intentionally trying to like pivot to a thing you didn't have legal access to, but you did, and now you're going to disclose. Because if you don't, chances are there are folks who do log collecting like Franklin here are going to see that you popped the box. And then if you haven't told them that you hit it, then it looks like a bad faith discovery, right? Does that make sense? So we're just trying to do the right thing. The elephant in the room is always CFAA. Who remembers what it stands for? Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So I'm just going to read you a little bit of jargon, and I hate to do that to you, but this is from my policy at GSA. If you make a good faith effort to comply with this policy during security research, we will consider your research to be authorized. We will work with you to understand and resolve the issue quickly, and we will not initiate or recommend legal action related to your research. What this doesn't say is that we won't get you. It says we won't recommend legal action against you. It's a fine line, but sometimes good faith isn't always good faith, so that's why OGC is going to have to approve any language in your non-disclosure policy. Okay, so reporting a find. A VDP is going to tell you how to do that, whether it's with a dedicated email like protect@iu.edu.
It's actually incident@iu.edu.
It's actually
and
incident.
Mike says everybody is please. Sorry, IT-incident@iu.edu.
Okay, so IT-incident@iu.edu. Okay, so dedicated email, check. It does us no good if it's not plastered everywhere we can find it. So visibility on that, check. If you have a VDP though, that's where security researchers are going to go. And truthfully, most researchers are going to email security at whatever. Almost everyone I know is going to do that first. And then if they get a bounce back or no response, then they'll go digging. A web form. So at GSA, oh, go ahead. Yeah.
It's protect.iu.edu.
Okay, so that is the fifth different. Okay, so it's protect@iu.
No, protect.iu.
Okay. Protect.
It's the web.
Oh, the website,
Yeah,
the web form. Great. Okay, so there's a web form. Protect.iu.edu. So at GSA, we're using a TLS encrypted web form, and this is so that researchers can report anonymously if they want to. Some researchers don't want a bounty. They don't want visibility. They just want to tell you what they found. They don't want to give you their names, and that's okay. So we decided in the federal space, at least at our agency, to give an anonymous reporting option. And then a platform. Does anyone know what I mean when I say reporting through a platform? Has anyone heard of like HackerOne? BugCrowd? There's another one, Synac, but they only run private programs. So I probably won't touch on them. Yes.
You say you have an anonymous option.
So
it's not really.
For our TLS encrypted web form in good faith, we are not logging IP addresses. But the folks reporting vulnerabilities through that platform are not eligible to participate in the bounty program or have any recognition for the find, because we have to be very careful in the federal space that we're not sending money to countries on like forbidden lists. right? So if you report anonymously, like, you get what you ask for, but we do give them the option to provide a way to respond to them, to just follow up and let them know that we fixed the issue. But the web form is not bound by the time frames, or it's like kind of a thank you for reporting. Here's a hug. That's kind of all you get out of it. Do I think that we could track somebody down? I mean, we're the government, like, of course. Anything done in Google is somewhere on Google servers. All right, so let's talk about putting it all together. So coordinated vulnerability disclosure. I'm not really a fan of the phrase responsible disclosure. I think it sort of like lends itself to there being such a thing as irresponsible disclosure, which I guess like announcing the vulnerability on Twitter is, but I don't know. I prefer the term coordinated disclosure. It fits more into this space. So piecing it all together, we would have a hacker reporting, right? Then our organization is going to respond. Stakeholders are going to be notified. The vulnerability is going to be mitigated. So we'll talk, you would have something called like a response workflow, right? Think about if you run a site, what it would take to just fix a typo on your site. Like who has to get involved, who can push to production. Those are the kind of things you think about in your response workflow. And then the vulnerability gets disclosed to the public. This is like the perfect scenario. You find a vulnerability, you write your paper, you report, they fix it, everyone's happy. You get to go present at Black Hat. The company gets props for fixing the thing. You get props for your research, everyone's happy. That's how you want it to go. Time, so like it's a race. Okay, so I'm just going to jam through these next few slides because they're less important and they have a lot of words. But VDPs, like, it wasn't my idea, right? These have been around a while. DOJ has a framework, so please do like check out the DOJ framework. I'll be speaking at DOJ in May talking about VDPs and ethical hacking and how the Department of Justice is trying to work with security researchers in the private sector and like bridge those gaps and find ways to build more trust between public and private sectors. So check out DOJ's site. I'll make sure Joshua gets these slides and then you'll have links to all this stuff. 18F, like I said, ours is out on GitHub. It's open source, pull it down. If you find a typo, tell me, do a PR, I don't care. But feel free to like fork it and see if, you know, I think a good exercise is thinking about your hypothetical application and what your vulnerability disclosure policy would look like. And if you have to turn in some code, right, you have to turn in a project, you know, turn in your VDP with it for extra credit, why not? DOD, remember they did a big Hack the Pentagon initiative last year. They also ran a Hack the Army. These are a little different. So VDPs, what I want to make very clear is a vulnerability disclosure policy is not a bug bounty program. These are not the same things. You have to have a vulnerability disclosure policy to launch a bounty program, but you do not have to have a bounty program if you have a vulnerability disclosure policy. These are two different things, and I don't want you to conflate them. They're not the same. Organizations may find themselves ready to launch a vulnerability disclosure policy and be years away from being ready for a bug bounty program. So I don't assume like, well, they have a VDP and then you're like looking around for the bounty program. They almost always like shouldn't have one. So just keep that in mind. And again, I'll make sure you get these links. If you find a vulnerability on a federal site and the agency, as over 90% of federal agencies don't have a clear path to reporting now, you can report to US CERT. US CERT is based out of DHS, and they'll investigate and get your report routed to the appropriate agency. They don't want to be the middleman, but until other agencies have their VDPs. Sometimes US CERT does have to serve as the middle person. We'll come back to that. All right, quickly, I'll just tell you about Bug Crowd. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Bug Crowd and HackerOne because these are public bounty programs. Again, CENAC has a bounty program, but theirs is private, so you have to register, and they do handle their security researchers differently. It's a paid service. Not really going to work out for like the group in this room or the folks online. Like what I want you to do is focus on the public bounty programs. Private ones, not so much. You get invited to those. It's different. So crowdsourced security. Anybody heard of that phrase? Crowdsourced security. That's what these platforms are doing, right? Researchers go, they sign up, they get vetted, they prove like their country of origin because again, we can't pay out to countries on forbidden lists. And then if you stand up your bug bounty program, mine lives at hackerone.com/TTS. You'll see the scope of what you can do, and you'll see what the bounty payments are. So if you want to like start dabbling in security research, this is where you get the list of places to start. You go to Bug Crowd, you go to HackerOne, and you see who's got public bounties on the platforms. Lots of folks do. Tesla has a really cool one. NASA lives on HackerOne with their Vuln disclosure policy, but NASA doesn't have a bounty program. So it's not just bounties that you can look for, but HackerOne's also a good place to look for VDPs because they do host VDPs for free right now. It's not trying to like sales pitch them, but it's a cool service that they'll host your VDP. And then researchers can go to HackerOne and search for your org and like maybe find your VDP. And if you have a bounty program, great. So if you want to like start just looking at vulnerabilities, if you want to start dabbling in research, or maybe some of you are already like established researchers, I would 100% instead of saying go see if a place has a program, just start at the programs and then go through the list of places that are participating. That's going to be a little bit easier path for you to find your money. All right, so bug bounties. I didn't leave time in the talk to talk about bug bounties because again, I don't think like 90% of places are ready for them, but I will talk about the Cobra effect because it's super fun. The trouble with incentives are they work. So who knows what the Cobra effect is? Oh, can I tell you a story? Okay. So way back when, British rule of colonial India, there were cobras going around, right? So the government set up this like bounty program for people to kill the snakes and bring the heads to like the town square or whatever, and then they'd get paid per cobra head. Are you with me so far? Right? Does anyone see how this could go wrong? So farmers stopped growing food and started growing cobras so that they could like kill the cobras and bring the heads and get the money. And then all of a sudden there like wasn't enough food for the villagers because the farmers were growing cobras, right? So then the government's like, well, we're not going to pay for cobra heads anymore because like you stopped growing food. So then what do you think happened? The farmers just turned all the cobras loose that were like alive, and then all of a sudden the town was like overrun with cobras. Okay, so the moral of the story there is the problem with incentives are that they work. So bug bounties can open a floodgate that you may not want opened if you launch before you're ready and then you're not prepared to deal with the vulnerabilities that come in. It's really not something you want to do till you're sure that you're putting your best foot forward. So I like the Elmo fired meme, so that's that. And look at, come on, it's amazing. You don't get too many memes at IU. All right. I'm happy to give you my .gov info if you have a question, concern about the federal space. I will let you know that I am I'm an Obama appointee. My term ends April 29th. So I'll be leaving federal service. Next Friday is my last day in the federal space. But I will still be available for contact and research, and I'm going into the private space as a federal contractor, which is like what we do when we leave federal service. So, but you can reach me on Keybase. If anyone has questions about what Keybase is, talk to me after, and we'll get you set up with some public keys. Like, it's super important. So I want to open the floor up now for questions. And Joshua, you can manage the online. So anyone have anything?
Mentioned TTS a couple times.
Yes.
What's that?
TTS stands for Technology Transformation Service. So it's a subdivision of General Services Administration. And a lot of the folks at TTS partner with the folks at USDS, United States Digital Service. So these are kind of your two Fed agencies that are working agile in GitHub using cloud infrastructure. So those are, if you want to join civil service and like not forget everything that you've learned in college, like those are the agencies to go to. Yes.
Related to the timeline for disclosure, what is my incentive to make that short? Why would I ever make it short, and why do I get to decide what the timeline should be? About guidelines that people have to follow.
Sure. The question is, what's the incentive to make the time short to remediate an issue reported through the VDP? As an organization, you're coming from that perspective. Well, so if a researcher's discovered a vulnerability on your site, for every like good researcher who's going to act in good faith that reports to you, there are probably 5 that haven't. So your incentive to kind of repair these issues, remediate these issues sooner rather than later, is so that you can focus on coordinated disclosure with the reporting researcher, rather than waiting for the bomb to drop that it, you know, is a black hat putting all your data out on Real Deal or.
Yeah, I'm not arguing.
Yeah.
Incentive to do it quickly.
Yeah.
When you say you can disclose after a certain amount of time,
Sure.
seems like never is a good.
Right. Well, yeah, but that doesn't really apply. Yeah, so that's one of the things that the DHS directive that we're desperately scrambling to finish before I leave the federal service addresses is guidelines. But again, we can't force on private businesses, like we can't change their policies or force them to implement policies because that's the nature of being a private business here. But in the same way that NIST provides guidelines, DHS can provide guidelines to say, here's what we think is reasonable for a critical, high, moderate, low. The companies can take it or leave it. But from a VDP perspective, if we're not talking about bounties, so let's just put those aside and we're talking about VDPs, a researcher could, in theory, find a way to disclose anonymously. And you wouldn't really have a way to like prove that it was them. So what we're looking at here, what all this is about is fostering these relationships between researchers and organizations to work together. What you're talking about would be kind of a counterintuitive, right? It would, like the org would kind of be shooting themselves in the foot if they're like, well, if you find a high, we get a year to fix it, and by the way, you never get to report it. They'll, if not them, someone.
It's going to go to the courts. In the courts, are they going to look at the VDP and say, well, you disclosed too soon, so you're going to jail? The company shouldn't be able to decide whether you're committing a crime.
Right. So then that would be a prosecution under CFAA and hashtag not a lawyer. But there are real people when you go into a court of law to say, now, wait a minute. The researcher gave you 6 months to fix it. You have no indication that you tried to fix it. Like, but that's why CFAA is not an ideally written law. That's why a lot of researchers struggle with it, because of things, there are a lot of gray areas. There are some really, really good folks over at DOJ who have tried several times to push through changes to CFAA, and then they hit timelines with Congress or politics. But I would say, organizations need to tread lightly and carefully. We have folks in this room doing research who want to be able to present that research. And I could see a reason maybe why at some point you would say this phone should never be disclosed. Maybe. But you'd have to give me a really good reason. Like if lives were at risk, then that would be sort of, otherwise, like, why wouldn't you? So guidelines, I think, are maybe a step in the right direction to at least say, here's what, if the government can fix something in 4 months, like a private organ can fix something in 4 months.
We are up against the time beast.
Okay.
And we are very thankful. Everybody, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Mike is only he's busy sending emails around USA right now talking about a real PDP.
Yay.
So thank you so much.
Yeah.
And there's a lot for us to definitely chew on. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.